Welcome back, everyone. The case out of Ferguson, Missouri, and the case that we're going to hear sooner than later, I believe, coming out of Staten Island surrounding the death of Eric Garner, they've once again showed, whether people want to acknowledge or not, that there is a divide between how not only different races look at the law enforcement and the justice system, but also the relationship between the black community and the police. And many of you may have seen this piece in the Times where Times columnist Charles Barkley says the issue of race and perception deeply rooted in the anger and frustration that's sweeping the country. He says that 45% of African Americans, compared to what just 7% of whites, believed that they had experienced specific instances of discrimination by police strictly because of their race. Well, there was a soundbite from Charles Barkley, who's never short of opinions, but it certainly got a lot of people talking. I want to share it with you. He is just one of many who are obviously sounding off about this perception and the distrust that many in the African-American community feel towards police. But he says cops often are the ones getting a bad rap.
We have to be really careful with the cops, man, because if it wasn't for the cops, we'd be living in the wild, wild west in our neighborhoods. I think we can't pick out certain incidents that don't go our way and act like the cops are all bad. I hate when we do that because think about it. Do you know how bad some of these neighborhoods would be if it wasn't for the cops?
All right, let's bring in our next guest here, Gloria Brown-Marshall, Associate Professor of Political Science and Criminal Justice Administration at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She is also a columnist for Black Star News and a journalist covering the U.S. Supreme Court as well. John Jay, as people know, where a lot of people in law enforcement come out of. Curious the perspectives as to the reaction to the case, and even when you hear comments like those from Charles Barkley about the role of police in neighborhoods where too often there's an us and them mentality from both sides.
Well, when you think about it, police have a tough job. They have to act on judgment all the time. Does this person look like they're going to harm somebody else? Is that conversation just a loud, emotional one? Are they laughing and joking, or is it serious? It's going to turn into something ugly. I understand that, and I feel an empathy for them. But I also need for police officers to understand there needs to be a deeper policing of themselves. I think within the group, they kind of know who the bad apples are, and because of this blue wall of silence, they kind of keep that to themselves. On the other hand, you have neighborhoods where you have good people who are low income, and therefore they're living in a neighborhood where they don't have all the resources, and they're assumed to be criminal because they're living in that neighborhood. So you have all these things taking place at the same time. And Charles Barkley is making a very spot-on comment. The police have a tough job. But on the other hand, black people of African descent are people who are hardworking, who have been in this country since 1619, have worked through some of the most difficult social and political injustices in this nation's history. And all of that, they still just want to be regular people who go to work every day, and their children, can walk the streets and not be victims of this random violence that takes place at the hands of some police officers.
One of the things that has come out of this is there's almost a resignation or inevitability by people saying, hey, depending on your zip code, it's just going to be different. It's just a different world. And there are certain communities, even not far from this studio. You go to Yonkers, you go to Mount Vernon here, you're going to get a different type of police relationship than if you go to Scarsdale or if you go to another community. Is that just more economics than color, or is it more color than dollars and cents?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's going to be economics because even poor whites get mistreated by police officers. We really don't talk about that. It doesn't come up as often. But the level of sense of violence, I think, is ratcheted up when it comes to people of color, based on this suspicion, this history. And I like to say, what would it take for a black person to show themselves to be nonviolent? It's like the burden is on the black person to prove you're not going to be violent, you're not going to be a criminal. What are we asking for here? That the assumption is to appease the sensibilities of the police officer, a white police officer, and sometimes police officers of color, to make them relax a little bit and not not pull the trigger, not ratchet things up to a sense of violence that must take place. That is, as you said, inevitable. And my concern is that the black community is stuck between a rock and a hard place. How do you, in that split second of judgment that police officer has, how do you convince that individual? Don't think about all these bad things that you might have going on in your mind. I'm just a working person trying to get home tonight, like you.
You know, Dominic always says the best thing to do is to be as real as we can about this. I'm telling you some of the comments that I've heard from folks post-Ferguson and even with the Garner cases. Well, if he just did what the cop told him to do, or if he didn't resist arrest on that sidewalk in Staten Island, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Just do what the cop says and we don't have a problem. You deal with the police and you obviously deal with congregants. What do you say when you hear that?
What I say to that is that if I have to lean in one direction, I'm going to lean in the direction of compliance. Compliance may not be an absolute guarantee that there's not going to be conflict or confrontation, but it guarantees that I'll have a better chance than if I'm non-compliant. And so to your point, Gloria, I think that I agree to the extent that the expectation of equality, the hope that I can just be treated as a human being, I think that's resonant in everyone. It becomes convoluted and it gets twisted when my actions somehow suggest that I am part of a small microcosm of a broader community. If I flinch a certain way, if I move, if I sound a certain way, then that may trigger something based on a prior experience I know nothing of. And a response in that moment. What we always have to be mindful of when we're talking about police officers is that in that moment, after training, beyond preparation, is discretion. And every officer has the responsibility to make a decision. Sometimes in that moment, how that decision is reached, it has to do with the training, has to do with the experience, has to do with bias, has to do with background, has to do with comfort level, has to do with maturity. Well, sometimes
and then you get into the whole expectation, and there's where this whole debate comes into. What's the realistic expectation of a police officer? Is he a regular person, or do you hold the police officer to a standard as he's the one who's legally carrying the gun? He's the one who's supposed to mete out justice. I want to go to the phone calls. Dwayne is calling us from the Bronx. Dwayne, thanks for joining us. What do you have to say?
Well, this is what I'm trying to say. I agree with some of the stuff that I hear, but I see cases where there was a young kid that was white that cops rolled up on him and asked him to roll down the window. His window was broke. He was trying to tell them that, and they grabbed him up and threw him to the floor. It's on the internet. You know what I'm saying? It's not only one race that's going through this. We all going through this. It could be a frustrated cop that day, like the guy who got choked with the cigarettes. Come on, man.
Well, I think there's even the more compelling one was out of South Carolina, if you guys saw that video. And I will say, since the advent of body cameras and dash cams, a lot of white people who said please, right? When you see a guy getting pulled over because of a seatbelt violation, he's asked to go for his registration, and he's going in the car, and he's shot. And he has the presence of mind to say, why'd you shoot me? And he said, you reached in the car. You would never believe that unless you saw that could happen in America. But that said, I'm just telling you from what people, it's funny, different communities, what they'll say, in church to you. People are saying, well, if they just do what the cops ask. I just never realized until I saw the polls and I've seen the reaction, Gloria, just how big a gap we have to cross. I think people wish, nobody wants to talk about race, right? But we are so far apart on this subject still. As much as people love to believe, with all the advancements we've made, all the tolerance that we're showing, we're still way apart on this thing, aren't we?
We are. But the good news is that we're having this conversation. The good news is that we're here today around the table talking about this. I dread the circumstances that brought America to the table, but I'm so proud that we're having this conversation. I think the other part we have to consider is it's only been 50 years since the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So it's only been 50 years that we haven't had to have riots and sit-ins and all of that in order to recognize that other people had equal rights. And so we're making incremental steps, and sometimes we make faster progress than other times. But I also want to talk about the differences in the community, because I've seen from the cop cam times when there are white drivers pulled over by white police officers, and these white drivers could be drunk, they could be cursing, they could be doing all these things. And I am just amazed that police officers are still talking to them rationally, still trying to have a conversation. And I thought, what would be the difference? You know, just I look at that. If this was a black or brown person being that disrespectful, being that outwardly drunk, kicking the police car, doing these outlandish things, and we just live still in these two worlds, these parallel worlds, where the expectation is for the black person to submit and for the white person to defend their rights. And what we saw in Ferguson were black people saying, I want to defend my rights.
I asked this question before. I know I'm up against the break here. Why Ferguson was a tipping point? There are more egregious situations, I think, than Ferguson. I mean, we'll talk what happened with the Gurley case in Brooklyn, a guy coming out of a stairwell. But Diallo, Louima, Dominic, you've covered these stories. To me, they're more egregious than, at the end, nobody debates. Michael Brown went in and slugged a cop in his cop car, right? And then what ensued from there, there's disagreements. We know what the grand jury said, but there have been more cases that I found were more egregious, but yet for some reason that was the tipping point in this conversation. And now we're on the heels of being 24, 48 hours, 72 hours from hearing about a case with Eric Garner that was caught in living color. A guy who died on the sidewalk in broad daylight in Staten Island. Where do you think we are as it relates to that? Where is the temperature and the mood right now? I know you've been trying to get the sense as to how Police Plaza is going to handle this. Is New York that much different than Ferguson in terms of the reaction? What's your sense?
And, you know, I really don't know, Richard. As I was listening to the professor, where you said things have changed, but from my perspective, having covered these cases for 30 years, it really hasn't changed that much. When I started out, I remember being sent to the courthouse in the Bronx, and I had to look at the autopsy pictures of Eleanor Bumpers, the grandmother that was fatally shot with a shotgun, 2 blasts. They went to evict her. Apparently she had a knife. Something happened. The police felt they needed to fire. I've never been able to get over looking at those photos. And it just seems that it's always, I just don't see the improvement. I'm hearing that body cameras are the answer, but I know that there are going to be some individuals that know how to turn them off and turn them back on. You know, so that's my immediate question. We're waiting for the Garner case, looking at that objectively. There's a strong possibility. In fact, I'm willing to bet there will not be an indictment. They're going to say, as the PBA told me in an interview, 1, it wasn't a chokehold. 2, if Mr. Garner didn't resist arrest, it would never have happened. And they're also going to point out that there's other major health ailments. I could be wrong, but I am telling you tonight, 30-year experience, I don't think there's going to be an indictment. I don't care what the video shows.
So then the question is, how does the community react? Obviously,
that I don't know.
And
that
obviously, there's a lot of invested parties in this. All right, we're going to jump to a quick commercial break here. A lot of issues surrounding this, including how the protests to this play out. Obviously, we saw what happened on the streets the night that the indictment did not come down when there was a no bill in Ferguson, Missouri. But it also played out on Sunday, right before a football game here, as members of the St. Louis Rams put their hands up in a symbol, and some said, you know, this is what you want. Athletes taking a stand. Others people said, wrong place, wrong forum, wrong platform. We'll talk about that and much more after this.